So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint these kind of storybook style children illustrations in Procreate. Now, the reason I think this video is special is because I'm somebody who's always struggled with drawing people and faces, and also coming up with color palettes and all the little details in the outfits. So in this video, I'm going to explain the whole illustration process, but I'm going to focus on how I overcome those two limitations that I struggled with. As usual, I'll list the brushes I'm using in the description below, but I think you'll be able to follow this tutorial with any brushes you're comfortable with. So the first thing we need to do is find some kind of reference image to base the illustration off of. I've always found that when I work from a reference, I usually end up with something that's much more interesting and creative. Pinterest is probably the best place to find images like this, and you can pretty much just search children's style or fashion, and you'll have an endless supply of really creative ideas. And a lot of these images also have unique poses, and I find that inspiring. And once we've decided on which reference to work from, we need to use it to build something called a concept, and this is really just like a sketch that's also been colored in. For me, I really struggle with sketching, so usually I just kind of forget about the proportions or making all the details perfect, and instead I'll just use simple shapes and just try to build out all the major elements. I have a trick I use to fix the proportions, and I'll show you that later on. And once the rough sketch is finished, we can color it in. Usually I do this by just setting the sketch layer to multiply, and then painting on all the colors on a blank layer below it. Now, all the colors are pretty much just coming from the reference, but once in a while I may have some inspiration, and I might try some other colors as an experiment. Next, once everything is colored in, I'm going to merge the sketch and the colors together onto one layer. Then I can use the warp and the liquefy tool to sort of fix the overall balance and also fix the proportions. In my illustration style, the children usually have kind of shorter and fatter arms and legs, and usually the head is a little bit large as well. So this is a great time to fix those proportions by kind of stretching and shrinking different parts of the concept. And lastly, with the concept pretty much finished, we need to use it to create something called a perfect outline. Now, a perfect outline is pretty much just like a line drawing, and this is what we're actually going to use to paint from. And the way I make this is by basically tracing out the concept on a separate layer. In my experience, it's a good idea to make the outline as thin as possible, and if you want, you can also turn on the stabilization in Procreate to make the line smoother. And there we go. Basically, once the perfect outline is finished, we can start preparing this for the actual painting stage. So here's the outline. I'll turn off my concept, and I'm actually going to hang on to this and keep it off to the side to use as a reference. Then for the perfect outline, I'll move it above everything, even above the paper texture. Then I'll set the transparency to multiply, make it a little bit lighter just so it's not too distracting, and then I can actually start painting on a blank layer down here. And the first step of the painting process is to block out all the main colors. And it's optional, but I like to sort of make an overall background wash first that just covers all the major elements. So in this case, I'm just going to use a kind of a skin tone color and scribble over everything. Then after that, I'll cut it back with the eraser so it matches the sketch. And then just to kind of quickly delete all this excess watercolor, I'm just going to use the selection tool set to automatic. I'll just select everything I want to keep first. There we go. Then I'll go to invert. That selects everything else. Then I can just tap on the layer and clear it. Now for the rest of the main elements, I'm going to block them out using a similar process, but it's a little bit different. So I'm going to use the jacket here as an example. So everything will be on its own layer, so I'll make a separate layer. Then I'll try to find the right color. For the brush, I'll use the medium quill. And I'll do my best to kind of fill this jacket in one stroke. And I'll try to follow the sketch as closely as possible. And that's because I'm not going to cut it back this time. I'm going to use a different technique. So just make sure you do this in as few strokes as possible and follow the sketch as closely as you can. Now, the reason I want to do it in one stroke is because if I lift it off and then go over it again, you'll have a little bit of an overlapping effect. And in some cases, that can have a nice texture, but it doesn't suit this. So if this happens to you, I recommend just blending it out. So I'll do that with the water blender. And once everything is kind of filled in like this, we need to correct it and fix it so it more exactly follows the sketch. And I recommend doing that with the liquefy tool. Now, the reason I'm doing this instead of erasing it is I really like the rough edge effect from this brush. So by using the liquify tool, we can correct it without ruining that edge. So I'll set it to push, and you can copy my settings down here. And I'm just gonna go in there and basically push my painting here kind of back until it lines up with the sketch. And this process does take a little bit of time, and you will have to adjust the brush size quite frequently. And there we go. I think that matches the sketch almost perfectly. And you can see it really does have a nice effect when I use the liquify tool this way. I think the edge just has a nice kind of natural, kind of organic feeling. So that's again why I'm using that technique. Next, I'm just going to go through and fill out all the rest of the major elements using the same technique, just making sure everything is on its own layer. Now for the hair, I do follow a slightly different process. So in this case, I'm going to use the Shoto brush. I'll kind of make a scratchy background wash. And then instead of using the liquify tool, I will just cut this one back with the eraser. And there we go, all the major elements are blocked out. And you can see in the layers panel, everything is just sort of by itself on its own layer. And at this point, we can move on to the next step, which is adding all the major shading. And I'm going to use a few different techniques to do this. And I'll start by shading the jacket first. So especially because we're dealing with yellow, which is a pretty sensitive color, I recommend doing the shading on a separate layer so we can kind of modify it. So I'll select the jacket layer, then I'll make a blank layer above it. And when I'm doing shading on yellow, I recommend using a pretty bright red color. There we go. Then for the brush, I'll use the medium quill, and I'm just going to draw on the shadows. And just like how it usually happens, I didn't follow the sketch perfectly, so I'll once again use the liquify tool to fix that. And usually with shadows like this, there's going to be a hard side and then a soft side. So to get that effect, I'm going to change to a water blender. I'm going to use the fluffy one because it doesn't scramble the colors too much. And I'll just use this to make the soft side. Next, I need to adjust the transparency mode to make this red effect a little bit less strong. So to do that, I'll just select this layer, and I'm going to change it to multiply. Then I'll lower the opacity to 0 and slowly raise it back up just until those shadows are barely visible. Now, wherever the shadow is going too far, you can just use the eraser brush set to the fine liner pen to cut it back. And I'll go ahead and repeat this same process for the arm that's kind of in the back. And once all these shadows are finished, I recommend switching off the sketch just temporarily, and this will give us kind of a better look at how much contrast we're getting. I think in this case they're too strong, so I'm going to lower the opacity of both shadows a little bit more, just to lighten the effect. And with these shadows finished, I can move on and do the one on the pants. And this one is a little bit of a more complicated shadow. So I'm going to make sure I have the pants layer selected. I'm not going to make a new layer and do them separately. I'll just do them kind of on the same layer. This time I'm going to use the freehand selection tool. And I just want to make a kind of a selection that covers just under the shirt there. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and then I'll just darken it. After that, I want to make another shadow just on this kind of the leg that's on the far side. So I'll make a selection like this. Once again, I'll darken it like this. Then I can grab the water blender, the one at the bottom, and I'll use this to make the soft side of the shadow. And then kind of looking at this, the shading makes this leg look curved, but this one is pretty flat. So I think I'll do another shadow on this side. But this time, instead of using the blender, I'm just going to feather it, and then I'll kind of darken it with the brightness slider. And then for the last shadow, it's very optional. I just want to kind of darken the neck and the chin area. And because this is a skin tone color, we have to handle it kind of carefully as well, just like how we did with the yellow here. So to do it, I'm going to make sure the skin tone layer is selected. Then I'll just make a selection around the neck. I'll feather it out a little bit. And usually with skin tones, you can darken it, saturate it, and then shift it towards purple. I think any other color than towards green or blue is nice. And it's barely visible and it's a pretty subtle thing, but it does add a kind of 3D effect here. And once the shadows are finished, we can turn the sketch back on. Then we can make a new layer above everything, and we can kind of start working on the face. And I'll start by making the eyes first. Basically, I'm just gonna make one eye on a separate layer, and I just make this almond shape using the fine liner pen. And then I'll scribble out the kind of iris or the pupil just using the colored pencil brush. After that, I'll refine it a little bit and then just duplicate it and mirror it over for the other eye. And then once the position of the eyes is kind of okay, I'll just merge them together onto one layer. Then I'll make another layer, and this is where I'm going to do the nose. And this is pretty simple. I'm just going to use the Shoto brush and a red tone. And I'll just roughly scribble on the nose like this. Then I'll use the water blender to kind of smooth out one side. And then I can finish it up by just using the eraser to cut it back into shape. And then for the mouth, I do have a little bit of a trick I use. So I'm going to make sure it's on its own layer as well. And I'll use a sort of reddish brown color. For the brush, I'll use the fine liner pen. And I'm just going to make a kind of a shape like this. It sort of like gets a little bit thicker in the middle. And then on the ends, I'll do a little circle kind of as a dimple. Then after that, I'll change the transparency mode of this to multiply. And I'll lower it so maybe it's just a little bit more faint than the nose. Then I'll make another layer above it. And I'm going to use the colored pencil brush to make a very thin line just as kind of a part in the lips. Then I'll kind of refine the transparency of this as well, just again so it's barely visible. Then once I'm happy with how it looks, I'll just merge these two layers together. Next, I can move on and do the ear, and I'm going to use a similar technique for this that I used for the nose. So again, I'll make a blank layer, and I'll use a sort of reddish pink skin tone color. This time I'm going to use the fine liner pen because it's fully opaque and it'll kind of block out the hair. And I'll just rough out the ear like this. Then after that, I'm going to change my brush to the water blender again, and I'll use it to smooth out this side of the ear. Then I can refine the shape with the eraser brush, and then scribble on some little details just in case I want to. Now in this case, this ear turned out a little bit too red, so I am going to adjust the color a little bit. I want it to stand out, but not this much. I think just a slightly redder version of the skin tone color is good enough. And this part is optional, but I am going to scribble on some rosy cheeks. It's kind of a stylistic thing, but I think it looks cute, especially on illustrations of children. And once all the major elements of the face are kind of roughed out like this, I recommend kind of zooming out, switching off the sketch, and just going in there with the arrow tool and just kind of refining the position of everything. And there's no science to this. For me at least, it's very intuitive. I don't always know where the best position for the features is, but I definitely can tell when something's wrong. So I just kind of mess with it and juggle things until it feels right. And I think this arrangement looks pretty good. So just to simplify things, I will merge all those features onto one layer. And it's optional, but this is also a good point to add some eyebrows. So I'll just kind of experiment with that using the colored pencil brush. Now I also considered the hair sort of part of the face. So next I'm going to add some texture to that. And to do that, I'm going to do it on a separate layer above the hair. So here's the hair layer. I'll just make a blank layer above it. And I'll just do some scribbles using the colored pencil brush in a slightly contrasting brown color. After that, I'll kind of adjust the opacity of this texture layer. I think I'll lighten it a little bit. And once I'm happy with how it looks, I'll merge it together with the main hair layer. And in this case, since she is wearing a hat, I think it makes sense to add a shadow on the hair. So I'll just use the freehand selection tool to do that. And with the face details and the hair finally finished, we can move on to my favorite step, and that's basically adding in all the remaining tiny little details. So to do that, I'll make a blank layer above everything. I'll turn my sketch back on, but I'll make it super faint. And then I'll just go through and fill all these out using the fine liner pen and the colored pencil brush. And there we go. I think those details look pretty good. So once all the details are finished and you're happy with how this looks, we can move on to the kind of last phase here. And that's basically refining and then warping the overall illustration. So for the refinement part, we have to merge everything together onto one layer. So I'll just pinch it like this. Then I'll make sure that layer is selected. And I'm going to go in there with the eraser brush. And I'm going to go along the edge and sort of fix any kind of overlapping errors. So for example, here, this is a little bit strange. And I'll just kind of repeat this process and go along the whole edge of the illustration, fixing any errors like this. And then lastly, with this refinement here, the very last thing we need to do is make sure the edge of the face is smooth. So, especially since this is a child, it makes sense the face is going to be pretty smooth. And this edge here is really crazy. So you could erase this back, but I actually want to use the liquify tool instead. So I'm just going to kind of move it around and smooth everything out a little bit. And after all the edges have been refined, we can move on and basically use the warp and the liquify tool to refine the overall balance and vibe. So to do that, I first like to kind of zoom out quite a bit, and I'm just going to use the warp tool to start. And what I'm going to do is just go in there and sort of refine the overall posture. I might also change a little bit of the proportions as well. Now, just like how we did with the face, this isn't an exact science. I'm just going by feeling, kind of trying different things and seeing what feels right. And there we go. I think this looks more balanced. Now, usually at this point, I'd go in there with the liquify tool and make some smaller adjustments, but this looks pretty good as it is, although the hand does look a little bit strange, so I'm going to do that in this case. So I'm going to use the liquify tool again, set to push, and I'll just go in there and mess with the hands and the fingers and try to make them look a little bit more natural. And there we go. I think that's a little bit better. Now, as a last kind of finishing touch, you can do some skewing, and this is something I do in a lot of my videos. Basically, I just use the distort tool on the whole illustration, and usually I'll look where the character is walking. I'll tilt them so they're facing towards that, and then I'll use this middle blue node to kind of slide everything back and rebalance it. Now, in this case, this looks better because it gives everything a little bit more energy to it, maybe even a little bit of perspective. But it does ruin how the feet are. I think for this illustration, it's really important that they're on a flat base. So I'm going to correct it using the warp tool. And there we go. I think that's a little bit flatter. And just like that, this cute storybook style character is all finished. Now, before I go, I want to mention something that I wish somebody mentioned to me when I was just starting out with illustration. So when you follow longer techniques like this, it's totally normal to reach a point like halfway through where you feel maybe you have a little bit of doubt or you feel a little bit discouraged. But don't worry about that. Just follow the steps and trust the process and finish everything to the end. And I think once you see the final result, and especially after you print it out like this, you're going to be so satisfied and it will really motivate you in your next projects. As always, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like. And here are 2 more illustration tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.